So today we're going to continue with our series of IMVU Toolkit exercises, and this time we are going to create another pose that requires us to use the toolkit and pose the avatar in a way that would ordinarily be tricky to do relative to how the toolkit presents the avatars to us. So again, let's just sort out our interface and duplicate current. Do that again. So double click, TikTok outliner. Whoops, no, TikTok 3D for that one. There's the other one, TikTok outliner. And then sort out the interface. .3D. Right, so toolkit. Let's just make sure we've got as much screen space as we can. Right, so toolkit. Sidebar. There's the toolkit if you don't know. So we need the animation tool for this. For avatar poses, we always use the animation tool. We can use the animation tool to create other types of animated objects. For example, if we make a furniture item, we could use the animation tool to create those. But the animation tool is specific to creating avatar poses. So of course, click on the append animation tool. There is our avatar. And of course, as we've said before, the skeleton is used by both. So what we see on screen is used by both male and female avatars. So we only get presented with one avatar or one version of the avatar, because the skeleton is applicable to both of them. So we pose our avatar using this, and it will generally then be used by both male and female. There may be some tweaking to the position of hands and the head and the face, but otherwise, generally speaking, we use the same skeleton for both of them. So for this, we're going to do a pose where the avatar is upside down. So ordinarily, this is our, as we've discussed before, this is our fixed point. This is our root. This represents, so let's go into pose mode. Go into pose mode and just remove the toolkit for now. So this thing at the bottom represents female, if you've never done poses before, female 03 master root. So that is the root bone that the avatar is locked onto furniture items and other poses or pose spots that are in rooms and furniture. That's what's used to lock. So it's a key, like a key and lock that positions the avatar correctly relative to furniture items. So that locks onto the furniture nodes, seat nodes. So that doesn't move. We generally speaking don't move that. So how do we turn this avatar upside down? Well, we generally do it by using the pelvis control. So this square one is representative of pelvis node. So the avatar has a bone that sticks out the back here. We can't see it because they're represented by these controls. But this represents that bone, and to position the avatar anywhere that we need it to be positioned off center. So if we need the avatar to be posed away from the root, we always use pelvis node, or the control for pelvis node. So in this case, we want to invert or turn the avatar upside down. So if we use the widget, so we've got our move, rotate, and we don't use scale. But if we select rotate, we'll get the rotate widget appearing. And all we do is just click drag the colored loops. In this case, we can do the green one. But as we note, we can see that the rest of the skeleton doesn't move with this, because the way that the avatar is rigged, this, well, not all of it, but it's set up so that certain sections of it can move independently of other sections. Let's just undo that, which makes it easier to pose or create certain poses. So if we I'll just press the G key, we can move the pelvis, and the hands and the feet stay locked in position, and this helps with certain poses. So if we want to move pelvis node, and we want to do quite a big movement of that bone, what we want to do as well is select, shift click the hand controls, so that's these two, and the feet controls, which are these shapes. So shift click. So those are the controls that control the positions of the foot, the calf or the ankle, and the upper leg. So what we have is a unit of selections that we can then move as a unit. So we can click drag on that green loop, hold control snap to the increments, and just rotate that around. Release. Use our move widget and position this where we want it to be. And then we can create the pose that we want. So what we want to do first is just set up the big position. So the gross position, which is the avatar upside down. So we use our selections and turn the avatar upside down, so we position it in a broad sense where we want the avatar to be, and then we fiddle with the pose. We do all the detail bits for our pose. So let's do this. So this avatar is hanging upside down by the toes because they use a white opacity map. This is what happens if you use a white opacity map. You'll be hung upside down by the toes until you stop using white opacity maps. So grab the hand, rotate that. So we can use the widget or use a shortcut key. So for rotate, that's R, R for rotate, and G for grab. And some actions will work on some bones in certain ways versus the way they might with others. So let's for example, the shoulder will only rotate. So even if you press the G key to move it, it will only rotate. And we just need to position the avatar and the bits and pieces. That hand's the wrong way around. There we go. Knees. And then we've got our elbows. These little triangles are the elbow controls. Then we've got the spine bones. So that's spine 04. This one is spine 03, spine 02, and then I think this one's for the hips. Spine 01. It's a bit too low, so we need to move this up a little bit. So pelvis, hand, shift click, hand, shift click, foot, shift click, and foot, shift click. Move that up. And that, let's stretch those out a little bit. And remember, so where is our center of gravity? So if they are being tied to the ceiling by their toe, the center line isn't quite through the body, so we want to offset that a little bit. Because of course we have to account for the weight of the body making it hang unevenly. There's elbow. So that will be our pose. We didn't enable auto key. So what we can do here with this now enabled, it'll register every position or pose that we create from this point on. But because we didn't have it engaged, what we can do is just select all, and then pose, animation, insert keyframe, and then we want location and rotation. Before we do that though, just make sure that the timeline scrubber is at frame 1, and then pose, animation, insert keyframe, location, rotation. That drops in all the necessary keyframes that we need for our sequence. So that's our pose. In fact, let's just would ordinarily, so we have to be careful about how the avatar twists, because we don't want to deform the mesh too much. Right, so that's our pose. And that little adjustment, because we had auto key enabled, will now obviously update. It'll override whatever keyframe is already in the timeline. But that is our pose. So let's save this. File, save as. And then we'll get the, let's see if we can fit this on screen. No, it's a bit too smushed up. There we go, untitled. So let's call this white opacity pose. Oh, and then it's 1. We need this in the right folder location. Which is that one. Let's save. Right, so that's our pose. We can export this now. And for that, we want to make sure that make pose is enabled and export all bones is enabled. Morph controls is disabled. So disable, enable, enable. So that changes the appearance of the timeline, and it'll, because we've disabled the morph controls, it'll toggle us out of pose mode. So make sure we go back in to pose mode. Just save over this again. Save increment. If we've got Blender 2.40, we can save increment. And that'll save an incremental version of the file, so we don't have to keep doing that ourselves. Right, so now that we've got that, we've got our pose. Let's just frame selected. Whoops. Select all, frame selected. So that is our pose. So again, just to recap, when we need the avatar to be off center or off root, this is the root, we use pelvis node. So in this case, we've turned the avatar upside down. So what we've done is selected pelvis and turned that upside down, along with selecting the hand and the foot controls. And we've moved those as a unit to give us our initial position of the avatar, and then once we've got that in place, we can pose the individual elements that we need. Right, so we've got make pose enabled, export all bones enabled, morph controls disabled, and that's pretty much it. Scroll down, and to export our pose, we use the button in the toolkit, not the FBX exporter. We don't use that. So all we need to do is just click on the export button. We'll get confirmation. So the appearance of the timeline will change, and this is the setup that's needed to make a pose. Otherwise, Blender won't export a correctly formatted file that IMVU can recognize. So all we need to do now is import this into Studio. So IMVU Studio. we need to create a new project, and we're going to derive from a PID, and we're going to use the empty 10,945,930 search. So we're going to use the empty mood because this is just a quick way to test whether the pose is functional or not, because there can be problems sometimes when we export our poses. So select, there's our preview, which is obviously nothing, and then we derive. So there's the avatar. So that's what we've got. So now we just import our FBX. So import FBX. Now we've got to find it in avatars, Blender, and it will be prepended. Is it animation or pose? I think it's pose. Right, pose. Right, so if we go back to Blender quickly, if you've got a lot of poses, or you are making a lot of poses, the default name, let's go back into pose mode, the default name that's attributed to the action is control_armature action. So that's this one. But of course that's generic. So if you've got lots of poses, you want to be able to see at a glance which one of your poses is which. So what we can do in Blender, before we export or after we export, we can do this at any time. We can rename that, so click, and let's call this white opacity. Resave the file and re-export. That'll redo the process, so again we'll get confirmation by the change in the action editor. So now we should have, there it is, white opacity. So we select and then open. Then we'll go through the import process. So that's what it's found, and it has found our animation. So set up FBX. We don't need to mess around with anything here. These are all okay. Next. No materials, so that's okay. Next. There is our sequence. Review. White opacity, so that's what it's going to bring in. And then just import. So it'll bring the file in. It won't necessarily do anything because it's not a mesh, it's not a furniture item or a room which will be auto-assembled. So now that we've got our asset, we need to assemble our asset as a component. So in the component panel, we want action, new action. There's the new action. So we want to edit that. So we need to rename the trigger. So in this case we want stance, but we can use stance.idle. Let's try that one. Action type, avatar, new ensemble, and in there we should find under asset for a skeletal animation, we should find, there it is, anim white opacity. So we want this to loop, so this is a static pose, so we only have one frame playing all the time. So frame 1 start, frame 2 end, 0 to loop infinitely. Everything else is okay. We can disable gaze if we want. that just prevents the head from moving around independently of the pose that we're dropping in. So apply, and then preview, and there is our upside down avatar pose. So if we just see what disable gaze does. So we want to edit this ensemble. So click on the 3 buttons, configure, scroll down, disable, then apply or preview, and we should see that the avatar's head starts to move around. So it will be able to look at other avatars and other, well, the camera, avatars, anything else in the scene, which can add to the effect. But in this case, we'll just disable it, so it locks in place. So all we need to do now is save file, save as, white opacity, save, and then once you've got that, we need to upload. So info panel, then we can choose our, so they're going to be a bit tricky for poses because it's not considering the whole avatar. So in this instance, we might want to add or upload our own icon, which we should have. There we go, tutorial exercise file. That'll be our icon, and it'll use it for both of them. Then we set the name, opacity punishment. We can set the compatibility, unisex, so that's for both male and female. So this pose will work with both avatars. Empty mood, profit, no keywords, everything else is okay. So let's just save this. So opacity punishment, unisex, so that's for both male and female. Profit, settings, and that's pretty much it. And then submit. Let's just save, submit. We'll get confirmation, and that's submitted to the catalogue. So that will go through peer review now once it's published, once we set it to being published, and that's it. So that is using the toolkit. That's how we use the toolkit to create poses where the avatar is positioned unusually, shall we say, relative to the root node. So when we do poses like this, as again another recap, when we do poses like this, we don't move this, we move pelvis node control, the square one in the middle. And if we do that, we'll likely have to also include the hands and the feet as part of the selection, so the entire avatar moves with that selection. So that is our quick upside down pose using the toolkit, the animation tool in Blender.